Welcome to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest running hiking podcast, downloaded over 1 million times worldwide and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage, coming to you from Bachelor Country.
This is episode 291 of the Australian Hiker Podcast. And in this week's episode, we bring you the last of our series on the K'gari Great Walk. And this week's episode's titled Reality versus Expectations. Before we get into today's episode, if you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published. And if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the Support Us page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. In this week's episode, we revisit our previous episode, episode 288, where we discussed what our expectations for this trip were. And we had a lot of hesitations in relation to the amount of information available and what we needed to know on trail. In this episode, we revisit those expectations and see how they pan out with reality. And as we progress, we'll make recommendations on things that will make your life easier if you plan on doing this trip. We hope you enjoy. Now, the first hurdle for us really was in relation to transport. And Jill pretty much did all the transport booking this time, which I'm very much glad of. And I think, this is a walk that's located roughly 300 kilometres north of Brisbane. So if you happen to be a Brisbane or a Queensland local, it's probably not as complex as if you're travelling from interstate. I mean, you could very easily drive north of Brisbane, take you half a day. You could have a really early start and pick up the ferry across to the island, or you could do it the day before. But for us and for people travelling from interstate, it certainly was a degree of complexity.
Yeah, I describe it as a bit like putting pieces of a puzzle together. And it took me a few days to work out what the plan was going to be. And, it took that time to make sure that I had each of the pieces of the puzzle in the right place, in the right sequence. So, we've talked about this previously, just quite briefly, but, normally we would make a decision about when we were going to start the hike, and then we would probably book flights. Often when we travel by air. On this one, it was almost like I had to work backwards a little bit. So work out the days in which we were going to be on island doing the hike, work out then whether or not we would be able to get accommodation at the beginning and end of the hike, work out then when we were going to get to the island and leave the island, and then book the flights so we could get there in the beginning and we could depart obviously at the end. So it was a really weird sort of experience, and I must admit I'd sort of plotted this out a few times and double checked. There was a moment, and I guess a little bit of a complication. I actually started the bookings during daylight savings, so that's not a thing for Queensland, and so that did my head in a bit as well, to work out the exact time we were going to be where we thought we would be and how that related to the planning I was doing. So it was a bit complicated, but, in the end, looking back, I'm thinking, not sure why it was such a mystery. And it did all work out. I did get lots of quizzical questions from Tim, who probably didn't trust very much and didn't trust that it was going to go to plan, but it did.
That was probably the major transport considerations. And we also had, once we got to the island and we were heading off to the trailhead, we needed to get a taxi from Kingfisher Resort, which was where we were staying, at 30 kilometres to the trailhead at
Dili Village.
The Dili Village. And when you think, okay, 30 kilometres in a car, that's not going to take very long, probably half an hour. But it was 30 kilometres on a four-wheel drive track.
A sandy four-wheel drive track.
Yeah, so it was a slower going than it would be normally than on a road. Every so often you'd come across traffic coming the other way, and somebody, whether it was us or the other parties, would have to give way, and that would often slow things down. So realistically, we left. I think we were due to leave at 9:45. The taxi turned up a few minutes early, so we probably left about 9:35, I suppose. And then it took us. It would have been 50 minutes, I think.
Yeah.
Actually, might have been about an hour and 10 minutes, I think, in total. And I think the taxi driver said normally they allow about an hour and a half, because the trip is dependent on the tides, and it's more dependent on the beach trip as you're approaching Dili Village. So if it's really high tide and it's really rough seas, you may not be able to get there that way. And while there are other alternatives, it's a much longer trip.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting thing. I guess there are two aspects around that. They had a lot of rain, so the sand was quite compacted on the trails, on the roads, which made it a little bit easier and a little bit faster, but you still did have to reverse out of the way for oncoming traffic if, it was quite narrow mostly. But once you got onto the beach, and it was dependent on the tides, but it was a really short run along the beach. So there's this, dependency that you have that really, is there and gone in a very short space of time. And you kind of go, oh, that's a lot of planning around that moment, isn't there?
It is. And as I said, we thought, okay, we're going to leave 9:45. We'll be there sort of at 10:30 and be able to start walk at 10:30. But we didn't actually start walking until just on 11 o'clock. So again, the first day you've got a couple of choices. You can either do a roughly about a 6 kilometre or 6-ish sort of kilometre to the first campsite, or then you do what we ended up doing, which was roughly about 14 kilometres approximately to the second campsite. And we thought, that's pretty crazy. We'll be able to do that. But, if you depending on what time you physically start the walk, if you don't start the walk till sort of 12, 1 o'clock, depending on the tides, that may decide that you're going to do the shorter option. So it's worthwhile considering that and what pace you can comfortably move at.
Yeah. And the other thing is, it is about the pace and the time you can get started, dependent on the tides. And the other aspect that I think is important, there's such a lot to see. So you might not be wanting to travel perhaps as fast when you're hiking as you would normally do, And that first day is a really lovely walk.
So that sort of brings us on to the trail tread itself. We were aware that Fraser Island is the largest sand island in the world, and we had expectations of having this soft, sandy sort of trail we'd be walking along, and maybe it was a case if you're walking along soft beach. But certainly with the moisture there, the beach travel was quite good in the four-wheel drive, and as our taxi driver said, you don't have really high pressure tyres. You tend to have the tyres much lower than you normally would, just so you don't sink into the beach. But even from a point of view of hiking, it was actually really good trail. It was soft, but it was also firm enough that it wasn't making it hard going. So it was quite comfortable on the legs and the feet. The taxi driver did say that when there are periods of very dry periods, both the roads and the trails tend to sort of become a bit harder because you are sort of sinking into very soft, open sort of sand. So
harder walking.
Walking and harder driving as well. So in most cases, we were walking on single-track trail, but we also had a fair degree of walking along Management Road, or what used to be Management Road. Mm-hmm. So, some of the roads looked like that they hadn't been used by vehicles on a regular basis. And I'm sure while they could be, if they really needed to be from fire perspective, there are enough blowdowns with trees that would have made it quite difficult. So it's it did surprise us with the quality of the overall trail tread. Campsite facilities was another thing that we weren't quite sure on before we left. So if you listen to episode 288, you'll notice that we talked about the expectation of where water would be. And as far as we could tell from the government website, there was a water tank at each site. This wasn't the case. There were some water tanks at some of the sites.
Well, they said that there was water available.
Yeah.
So you had to be a bit creative about that.
Yeah, and sometimes the water available meant you walk down to the lake and filled water from the lake. So bring a filter, definitely bring a filter. And sometimes there was one of the campsites that had a tap. The very first campsite that we walked past, we thought, there's nothing here. Where's the water? And we walked about 100 metres further on, and there was the day picnic area, and inside the day picnic area there was a tap which says no drinking, and that's pretty standard with all the national parks. They say do not drink the water unless you treat it. So if anything does go wrong, it's on your own head. But yeah, it was trying to work those sort of things out. And we had one of the campsites, and it could have been a case in a couple of the campsites, you could get water out of the basin outside the toilets. You'd need to be creative in how you do it and getting the water bladders in there, or getting a smaller container in there to fill up.
There was a bit of decanting that I had to do. The water's usually my job, and there was a little bit of filling up a smaller container and tipping it into a slightly larger one. So, but again, I mean, we were filtering, so that wasn't so much of an issue for us to in terms of contamination, if you like.
Toilets, there was a toilet at each and every campsite. Now, I suppose they fall into two categories. The walk-in campsites where hikers are using, there was one toilet and that was it. Now, there was typically a bit of space in there, so you could actually get in there, do your business, but there was also enough space to fit. Worst case, if it's bucketing down with rain and you feel like having a bit of time out of the rain before you have to set up your tent, there's certainly plenty of space to do that with the toilet facilities.
It's not the most desirable place, Tim, really.
But we did actually end up putting our gear together and packing up just outside the overhang on one of these toilets, just because it was easy just to bundle everything up, take it over to the porch outside the toilets and put everything together there.
It was pouring with rain, and, the leeches were out in force, so it did give us a small reprieve, but it wasn't the most ideal location.
The other types of toilets were those that were used heavily by day trippers. So where you could drive your four-wheel drive in or the tour bus in, there might have been 3 or 4 or 5 toilets there depending on the size of the area, usually a disability toilet there as well. Although in one instance there was a disability toilet there, as long as you could get up a set of stairs. So technically not a disability toilet. But the toilets in most cases were reasonably clean, although there was one site where there was just toilet paper all over the floor.
It was horrible. Yeah,
and it might have been just that it was due for a clean the next day, but all the others were pretty, I won't say pristine, but they were all very clean. So it was just this one where people had just been really messy and had rubbish everywhere. Toilet paper availability varied, particularly where there were day trippers coming in. There seemed to be toilet paper readily available. It was the hikers only campsites where there was a few of them that ran out of toilet paper. Yeah. So I think I'm sure it depends on the time of the year and how busy it is, to how often they stock it up again. But we always take our own toilet paper with us just to be on the safe side. And again, this is a trail where you are technically not allowed to go to the toilet on trail. Now, what that means is they don't quite clarify what that means. But no digging holes, doing your business and burying the toilet paper is what is supposed to happen. Now, what you're supposed to do if you're desperate, you can say, I've got another 6 kilometres to go and I absolutely have to go to the toilet. But yeah, don't plan on doing it because you need to work yourself between campsite to campsite.
Well, I think if you're desperate and you have to go, you're supposed to do it in a little bag and carry it out.
Yeah, yeah, and that's true. That's true. So yeah, it's the sort of thing. Don't plan on digging holes, or else plan on carrying out if you absolutely need to.
And I guess, there was a reasonable amount of toilet paper. The way I would measure that is the stack of paper that we brought home. So we do take our own paper, and we've still got, a reasonable wad of folded toilet paper ready to go for the next trip. So, it wasn't too bad, but you just couldn't rely on it.
Now, tent pads varied. Again, it was a sandy base, and in most cases, there was quite a large area. I think most of the tent areas, you could probably fit 2 tents rather than one, so there was a good amount of space. Although some of the campsites, you had to be picky and find one that wasn't on a slope. We had one night where it was on a slope, and I was on the uphill side, and I kept on having to wedge myself so I wouldn't push Jill into the side of the tent.
I was squashed up on the side of a wet tent. Anyway, we won't talk about that.
Facilities at each of the sites, there was a flat table, for want of a better term, a slatted table that was probably about 60 centimetres off the ground, so you could sit on that, you do what you needed to do. Attached to that was a metal lockbox, so any food was supposed to go in there, even though in almost all cases, but not all, the areas were fenced, but there were some areas that weren't fenced, so you didn't want to have your food in your tent anyway, because that would just encourage dingoes if they're around.
And most of the sites we camped at weren't fenced, and that was a little bit sort of worrying at first, but as we look back, it wasn't an issue. The other thing about the lockbox for your food, and if you wanted to put your packs in there as well, the lids are very, very heavy. So, there is option to put a padlock on them, but you don't really need to do that because the lids are heavy enough that it would be quite difficult for an animal to lift it and get your stuff out.
Yeah. We had one of the campsites, in fact, it was the last campsite on day 5, where we actually had a picnic table and bench. And this was a campsite that a lot of day trippers came into, and there were a lot of picnic tables scattered around. But we picked a site that was virtually designed for 3 tents, and this picnic table, as well as the flat table and the lockbox in there, and that was quite good.
So that would have been quite a nice spot for a group travelling together and, being able to socialise. So, yeah.
Now, we've talked about water briefly, but I think water was actually readily available. But from my perspective, it was an issue if you could go past a stream and collect water. Really, that didn't seem to be an option. I don't think I saw any streams. Well, there were 1 or 2, but I wouldn't rely on it. So if you desperately needed water, there was a really nice clear stream at the Central Station campsite area. But there was also other water you could get from there without having to go to the stream. But in most cases, it's not a matter of, unless you happen to drop into one of the lakes and collect water from the lakes, there aren't lots of little water sources as you go. No. And we were there in not the wettest month, but we're in there in one of the wetter months. And we'll talk about weather in a few more minutes.
Yeah, and just on getting water out of the lake, a couple of the lakes had very shallow shores, if that makes sense. And it is a little bit difficult if you keep your shoes on. It is a little bit difficult to fill up your water bladders and so on. So having some way of collecting water in a smaller vessel and then tipping it into your filter arrangement is probably something to think about as well.
We used a gravity feeder for our water filtration, so it's a Gravity Works filter, and it had a 2-litre bag, so you could just scoop the 2 litres in, and that was probably relatively easy, although it can be a bit difficult to do up sometimes.
I'm sorry, Tim, it was not easy, okay? It would be half full and then I'd have to use a smaller container and tip the water in. Thank you very much for all your help on that.
Particularly when you had to go down to the lake to fill up water, you tried to minimise the trip. So we had a bag which we filled up with 2 litres, the Gravity Works which was 2 litres, and we also had a little Katadyn Be Free 600ml filter bottle as a standby filter. So that was generally enough to get us through the evening and going the next day.
I'm just fascinated by all these we and us words you're using there, Tim. But anyway.
So again, bring a filter of some sort or bring water treatment tablets, whatever it is you like doing. It's good to get, the water is fairly clear in most cases, but it's good to get the particulates out as well.
There was one source that did have a lot of particulates in it. So, if you're using, say, tablets, I'd also suggest that you strain the water in some way because there were some lumpy bits.
Okay, that now brings us on to mobile and internet reception. Now, we did this trip in late April, early May 2024, and one of the things that was happening as we were there is they were upgrading the cellular phone towers from 3G to 4G. So hopefully by later in this year, that'll be 4G coverage. However, it's really on the edges of the island. Mm-hmm. At Kingfisher Resort, not a problem. At Dili Village and also at Happy Valley, there was signal there. But on the trail itself, it was pretty variable. Sometimes
it was pretty non-existent, actually.
Yeah, really, it was okay to get text messages. Very occasionally, you might pick up enough internet signal to download emails, but really, you're not going to be surfing the internet or expecting reliability, at least at the moment. And that may not change even with the new 4G towers, because there really is no population in the middle of the island. It's all on the edges. So if you're absolutely reliant on internet, unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do on that one. Now, dingoes, and this is probably one of our biggest concerns. The start of 2024 has seen probably more dingo attacks, at least in the media, than we've seen over the last few years. And it was coming towards the end of dingo breeding season, and the dingoes are out wandering looking for mates and looking for food. And we were really concerned about dingoes. We only saw 2 on the entire trip. As we were getting in the taxi being driven down the beach, we noticed a dingo walking along the beach, and apparently that's pretty common to see. And then the only one we saw on trail was at Mackenzie's Lake, and that was up near the toilet facilities, which is where the parking area is, and you assume that if there's any scraps of food, that's where it's likely to be. But one dingo only, and I did actually see a footprint on the trail at one stage, but otherwise nothing around. So that really did surprise us.
Yeah, they were probably there, but we didn't see them. They were probably more watching us. One of the things that I expected was to hear them, howling at night and so on. Didn't hear any of that. Probably the rain kept them mostly quiet because we did have some nights where it was very, very heavy. But yeah, dingoes are not an issue, apparently.
But having said that, though, one of the issues with the dingoes is that strong recommendation is you do not hike solo because you're less of a threat when there's only one of you, as opposed to 2 or 3 or 4. And I noticed the one dingo we did see on trail was Jill was coming out of the toilet block at Mackenzie's Lake. I was coming up the pathway and saw a dingo looking to where she was and what she was doing. It saw me and decided, nope, too many people, and disappeared off fairly quickly. So again, the recommendation for this trail is not to do it solo. And also to carry a stick of some sort with you, whether that be a wooden stick or a tracking pole, which is probably quite a handy thing. It's got a nice little sharp point on it. So if you do need to prod a dingo that's getting a bit close, you don't want to do it for no reason. But if you're feeling threatened, then you need to have something between you and it that's going to make it go away, basically.
Yeah, and we did go to the toilet blocks alone, but we would always carry a hiking pole with us. And I guess the other thing we haven't mentioned around the campsites that are fenced, you do really need to think about closing the gate well. Sometimes you need to spend a bit of time doing that. There were a couple of gates within those around those fenced campsites. You had to be vigilant about closing the gate and making sure it was locked. So, that's probably something that most people wouldn't be thinking about.
Now, the fences around those sites that were fenced were about 2 metres high. I'm guessing that dingoes don't jump, or if they do, they don't jump that high. And one thing to note, though, is the toilet facilities are outside the fence areas. So if you're getting up to go into the toilet in the middle of the night, you're going outside the protective fence area. So, definitely take a torch with you and definitely take a tracking pole with you when you go to the toilet.
Yeah. And wake your partner up and they can come with you too.
Yep. Leeches were something we didn't expect. Now, we did have contact from one of our community just the day we were travelling, and they said they made a couple of comments, and we'll talk about some of the others later, but one of the ones were there are leeches everywhere. And again, it's not unrealistic. Tropical areas, you would expect to get leeches, but it was something I just hadn't thought about before we went. And it was particularly in what you'd class as the rainforest areas that were heavily treed, wet ground because there was a lot of rain, and I managed to pick up 2 leeches. There are photos of the impacts of leeches, one where it looks like I'd slashed my knee open. Leech had gone by that stage, and another one which a half-full leech happily sucking away on my leg. So I took a photo of it before I got rid of it. But normally it's Jill. They tend to have. They said,
you thought you were going to be safe, didn't you? Yes. I think the thing is, though, we were quite vigilant around the leachy areas. So while you only got 2, there was a lot of effort to make sure that you didn't get more than that. I probably looked really weird at points on the trail. I worked out that if you were standing still but kept moving your feet, that it was much more difficult for them to latch onto you. So if you're going to stop and look at something, just keep tapping your feet. And it probably looked really weird. That did help me not to pick up a whole range of leeches.
And I think in both Jill and I, in my case, we probably got rid of about 4 or 5 at least off our shoes before they'd gone anywhere. So again, certainly if we had stopped for whatever reason, we'd always check our shoes to make sure nothing was crawling up and making their way towards skin. But yeah, it's really interesting when you're standing there and you're watching these leeches move across the ground heading towards your shoes. Yeah. It's quite interesting. They manage to detect breathing animals of some sort very well, and warm-blooded animals, and they can pick that up from a distance. So it's not unusual that we were walking down the middle of the trail, and these things were all making their way to us. So if you stood still for any period of time, they'd be on your shoes and then trying to make their way up your legs.
Yeah, and a bit of a tip: put some spray or cream insect repellent on your shoes and apply it, regularly, because it was damp, so it would wash off a bit. And that was really useful to sort of deter them reaching up. They, not so used to that stuff at this stage, and you could see them recoil.
And this was DEET. I don't know about the other types of repellents, but DEET is certainly the way to go.
Bushman's. I had a little Bushman spray. It smelt terrible, bad perfume, but it was on my feet, so it was okay.
And we did have issues with the mosquitoes in other areas as well. So every so often we'd put some on our heads also. But it's typically not something I tend to carry, or we tend to carry on trips as insect repellent, but definitely worthwhile and definitely help in keeping the leeches or the number of leeches away. Now, the scenery. One of the other comments that was made to us is this walk is very much a green tunnel. And we thought, okay, day one, we thought that's what it's going to be like. That matches up and it'll change. And towards the end of day one, we came out on the edge of the first lake, and we were making our way around the top of the lake out in the open. So we thought, okay, a bit of variety. But the best way to describe this walk is, yes, it is a green tunnel, but in some respects that's not necessarily a bad thing. That had the impact. It had a number of impacts, including we had reasonably heavy rain. We were in the rainforest areas, and we weren't getting saturated. It was only when you get strong winds come through that it'd shake all the water off the trees. That's when the water would drench us. But otherwise, a lot of the heavy rain wasn't getting down to ground level, which was quite surprising. The other thing is that this also impacts on what you're going to see. So in relation to big open vistas, that's not what you're going to get on this walk. So if you think about the Great Ocean Walk in Victoria, or even the South Coast Track in Tasmania, you often get vistas across a large section of many kilometres. You do not get this on this trail. It's more about what is close. It surprised us. It forced us to look at the small stuff, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the thing that did surprise us was that even though it was a green tunnel, it wasn't the same green tunnel.
Yeah, that's right.
The vegetation would change, and it was, you'd all of a sudden be walking through a rainforest, and 15 minutes later you're in dry, open forest still, but it was dry bushland. So you were seeing different vegetation, and quite often it was noticeable. It was almost like you cross over a road and the vegetation just changes totally.
Yeah.
Or I think what it was you come across on the south side of the hill and end up on the north side of the hill, and again, the whole landscape just changes. So in that respect, no big vistas, but certainly plenty to see as far as changes were concerned. Animal and bird life, so apart from the dingoes, not much in the way of animal life. So I think Jill saw what was probably a wallaby scuttling off into the bush fairly quickly. Really, it's probably too vegetated to see many kangaroos around the place. We saw two snakes. The first one, Jill actually stepped over. I was a couple of metres behind her and thought, oh, there's a snake. And it was a python that was, I'd say, somewhere between 2 and 3 metres long. And probably the reason we didn't notice it so easily was there were a lot of fallen branches that were about snake size lying on the ground. So it was just they were just there, and all of a sudden thought, that's got a very different pattern.
And it wasn't on the trail; it was just off the trail. But because there was a fallen tree over the trail, I went along the tree trunk and to the end, and then around, and it was just sitting off the trail, I don't know, about 60 centimetres away from the tree. So, yeah, it was once you spotted it, it was like, oh my goodness, but it was just lying there incognito.
And I think, you're not supposed to attribute human emotions to animals, but it was almost like, I've got my head under the smallest bush I can find in the area, so you can't see me, even though 99% of the body was out in the open. But I could actually get down there and see the eyes just underneath the bush, and I wasn't that close. I was a few metres away and be able to see that from that sort of distance. But it was like, if you're not bothering me, I'm quite happy, and I won't bother you either. So it didn't move; it just stayed there. It was quite happy. Jill also saw another snake later in the afternoon, again on the sunny section of the trail. It was a brownish colour, but we didn't get close enough to see the size or the length of it. We just saw, or Jill just saw the snake moving off the trail.
And it moved pretty quickly off the trail.
So I hadn't really thought about snakes. I mean, I always expect that potentially we can see snakes on the trail, but given we'd been walking for so long and hadn't seen any, it just sort of went out of our mind. Bird life was probably the main thing. Kookaburras certainly are around. Lots of little smaller birds, which I still haven't worked out what they are. And, we found that one campsite, and it was the campsite that was Valley of the Giants, which was where we had the leech problem. These birds were following us around because obviously as we kicked up leaf litter, they were in there to see what food we were kicking up and exposing as well.
Yeah, and there was some beautiful, they look like wrens, and there were beautiful bright blue ones, and others had this really sort of burnished gold on them, and very, very attractive, very active, and quite common across the island as well.
Really, from there, what surprised us, and this brings us back to the comment of the Green Tunnel, is the amount of fungus that we came across. Now, again, I'm used to fungus in Tasmania and places like that, and in the Tasmanian rainforests. But certainly, I don't know why, for whatever reason, I just didn't think we were going to see much fungus up there. Now, the month we were travelling, late April into May, the forecast for rain was about 60 millimetres. The heaviest month of the year, which I think was the month before, was about 120 millimetres. But because of the moisture around, there was fungus everywhere, including some out on the sandy areas near the lake, which really surprised me. So spent a lot of time taking photos of fungus. I've put up on Instagram and on the website the key ones, but there's a lot of photos I didn't use. And we just saw, it was just constant.
Yeah.
And there were some really attractive ones, little bright red ones, little bright blue ones.
Yeah, and it was a little bit sad. I felt sad for the ordinary ones because we'd see them, we go, oh, take a photo. No, not interesting enough. So there were a lot that we didn't take pictures of, but there were some really spectacular ones.
That we love fungus, so we can quite happily state, we did spend a lot of time trying to get the perfect shot lined up, which didn't always work. And when it's raining, it's hard to take a good photo.
And when the leeches were out, that was always a bit awkward. Yeah. The other thing we haven't talked about are the big things in life, because some of those trees are just awesome, and that's a lot of where the most of the fungus was growing, so it was really, sometimes we'd be looking on the ground and other times we'd be looking up into the trees, we probably missed a lot as well.
Now, weather. We had a preconception before we went up that, look, this is Queensland, it's north of Brisbane. The forecast on the Weather Bureau was 25 to 30 degrees just about every day. And again, this is Queensland, so we're expecting a lot of humidity. And that's not my favourite weather conditions for hiking in. So I thought, okay, well, that's fine. We're not doing huge days. I think our biggest day was probably about 16 or just a bit over 16 kilometres.
17, yeah.
So it was the sort of thing that we didn't have to worry too much about, doing 30 kilometres a day and trying not to pass out in the heat. But there was enough rain, and the rain really was a bit in patterns. You'd get an early morning shower in a lot of cases. You would get a shower around about 5 o'clock, and I think we did that every day except for one day. We had a 5 o'clock shower. So in that case, you need to get to camp, set up your tent, get everything in the tent first off, and then deal with dinner and everything else, because
it buckets down.
Yeah. We had, on the first night, it was reasonably heavy, and we were just eating our food, and it was like, oh, quick, we've got to put all our stuff away and get in the tent and eat the food in the tent. And it was just something we hadn't expected. So it was fairly consistent. We had one night in particular, it started raining at 5 o'clock at night and didn't stop raining pretty much until 5 o'clock the next morning. So, that added probably a couple of kilos to the tent in water. We actually stopped that day and, for 20 odd minutes and dried it on the trail a couple of times just to get rid of the excess weight.
And just on that, I mean, during the day, mostly it was either not raining and the sun was out. And so we did get to dry the tent during the day. So it really didn't matter whether or not, you had to pack up and carry a wet tent for a little while. There was always an opportunity to air it out so you weren't putting up a wet tent. I think there was once we did put up a wet tent, but it soon dried out.
And I think as a result, I had a quilt that I was trying out and testing. Jill had one of our sleeping bags, and we ended up just using the quilt folded flat. Would have been nice to have been slightly bigger, but otherwise it worked pretty well because the temperature at night time was probably 15, 16, 17 degrees. Mm-hmm. So it certainly wasn't cold. So in that respect there, now I know looking at the weather patterns for later in the year that sometimes the temperatures do get down to sort of 9 and 10 degrees at night time, but it's worthwhile, depending on what time of the year you travel, is look at what the temperature at night time is going to be. You don't want to have a sleeping bag that's designed for the alpine areas. It's just not going to be effective. You want something that's going to cope for the conditions that you're going to be dealing with at the time.
Yeah, and we haven't talked about this, but even when it was raining, it wasn't cold rain. So during the day, if it was raining, unless it was super heavy, we generally didn't put our rain jackets on. As long as I've got a peak on my visor or my hat and it's not dripping down my face, I don't mind, and it wasn't at all cold.
Now, one problem we have, and it was a problem of our own creation, was we were travelling on Anzac Day, and as a result, the shop hours...
That wasn't the problem.
No, that wasn't the problem. And the problem was that the shop hours were different than what we would normally get on any other day of the year. Most shops tend to open a bit later. We were contacted by the ferry and bus company to say, oh, look, you, depending on, if you're getting in the flight would you like to get the earlier ferry to the island? And we thought, okay, that sounds good. And we did actually contact them and asking about gas, and they weren't quite familiar with the gas bottles. There were camping stores in Hervey Bay, but weren't open at the time we came through. So we took the risk and thought, okay, we'll be able to pick up gas on the island. Not the case. Apparently, for whatever reason, they've been having trouble getting the gas for the little canister jet boils and MSR stoves. So even though we tried to pick up gas on the island, not an option, so we ended up cold soaking.
Yeah.
Now, that worked well for most of the meals. There was one meal that didn't sort of cold soak so well, but most of them did, and that was fine.
Yeah, that's a topic for another review, I guess. But the food was fine, and the temperature of the food and of at the time that we were eating meant that we probably didn't need something warm. And I did reflect on that if it was warm or a hot food, I probably wouldn't have eaten as much. The temperature was such that you really didn't need a hot food in your belly. I guess the reminder about the gas canisters is that we were flying, so you can't fly with them. You have to get them at your destination. And, that's probably just a reminder for people who maybe sometimes forget those things. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think a couple of things that we could have done to fix that, and we just didn't think about it. We just forgot about the Anzac Day component, which was what the issue was. So, we could have, if we had thought a bit more about it, we could have talked to one of the camping stores and say, look, can you deliver? We'll pay you, but can you deliver a canister to the bus
ferry company,
the ferry company who also does the bus transfer, and that would have made things easy. Or the other alternative is to take a stove that uses methylated spirits rather than a gas canister. But it depends on whether you've got that and you're happy with that. So really have a think about that. Or like we did, just work with cold soak, and that was fine. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's the key things you probably need to be aware of with doing this trip. Jill actually bought an insect head net. She didn't use it, and I didn't bring one. But, certain times of the year that may well be an issue. Another thing to think of as well is they do burning off on the island, and while it never typically affects the trail that much, it may be an issue with you getting smoke drifting across, that if you've got a respiratory condition or you just don't like the smell of smoke, you might want to avoid those times. And I think the other thing that we haven't really mentioned is bush bashing. Now, on the first day, we had a couple of blow-down trees, some of them large and most of them were quite tiny, that we had to work our way around. And on that first day, we came across two rangers in one of those little small farm vehicles, almost like the little tiny car things, and chainsaws, and they were obviously cleaning up that section of the trail. Now, that was section one of the first day, and maybe that was the start of the cleanup, because there were tree blowdowns along the trail that we did have to make our way around, and that would have improved the experience on the trail. But, when you're in a tropical area or a semi-tropical sort of area and you're getting a lot of stuff, particularly during the heavy rains falling across, at some point you're always going to have that on the trail anyway.
Yeah.
We one of the big issues for us is we had one day where we went through an area on Management Road that looked like it had had a bushfire in the last year or two, and we were bush bashing to get our way through the trail, and it was wet.
Yeah, so the regrowth, given the climate, given the rain that they'd had, the regrowth was very green and lush, and because it had been raining, very wet. And at one point, I'm thinking, oh, did I miss a trail marker? I think I did say in one of the podcasts, I felt quite confident as long as we were heading north. So we walked south to north. As long as we were continuing to head north, because the roads generally ran west-east across the island. At some point we'd come across a road and, there'd be some indication of where we were. But it was tough going. And we did pop out and it was like, oh, exactly the right spot, not an issue. But I think it was testing Tim's trust in my navigation, that's for sure. I don't know how. I just stopped answering the question, is this right? Is this right? I just ignored him for a little while and just kept walking.
And that raises one other thing I hadn't actually remembered to think about was the trail signs. Now, in most cases, all of our long trails in Australia, or all the ones we've certainly come across, there's been a dedicated trail sign. So it might be, on the Bibbulmun, there's the little Indigenous snake symbol. On Great Ocean Walk, there's a specific symbol. On most of the other trails, there's a dedicated symbol that says this is the trail. Now, on this trail, it's a series of hikers or camping signs with arrows. And once we realised that was the case, that was fine. We had one instance at the Lake Wabi campsite. It wasn't obvious which way we should go. Now, there were two options, and they both ended up at the same place, but it wasn't apparent from the map or from the signage which is the direction we should head to. So we could have just walked straight out of the campsite, straight across the trail, and ended up taking that section when it would have been perfectly fine. But we opted to walk up to the toilet block, use the facilities, and then take the upper route, and not far into the walk, the lower trail connected. So it was definitely the right route, but we were pretty sure we were okay, but it wasn't 100%. And in looking at the trail that's lower near the campsites, it was very overgrown. So I think most people would walk up to the toilet and then walk out follow the signs to the lookout to the Lake Wabi area. Yeah, it's a sort of thing, you get used to certain things in certain parts of Australia and it doesn't necessarily transfer to every other state. So for us, this is the first multi-day walk we've done in Queensland. So, it maybe this is a statewide thing or just that island in particular, but it was interesting. We just hadn't really thought about it as such.
Yeah, and the other thing that is prevalent is that you get written guidance. So just under the trail arrow is written guidance to the next campsite or the next campground, and not beyond that. So it's it's rare that you've got a list of destinations and you're going, oh yeah, well we know where we're headed. So it's one by one almost, mostly. And I guess once you're on the trail, it absolutely makes sense. For us, after a couple of days, we're a little bit more comfortable. But in the planning, it was quite difficult to kind of get a decent map of the trail. And there's one in the write-up, which I think would have to rate as one of the most comprehensive that's available, because certainly we struggled to work out, you had the destinations, you're going here, here and here, but what was in between was really hard to see.
Okay, that's all for this week's episode. And I think before we finish off would we recommend people do this trail?
Absolutely. Loved it. The different vegetation, the whole sort of isolation. I mean, it is a very wilderness type of trail, and you won't get fancy facilities. But if you're looking for that wilderness opportunity, despite the leeches, this is a really good one. And the other thing, everybody that we encountered, Wayne the taxi driver, Wayne the bus driver, it just seemed that everybody was called Wayne. If you're a male of a certain age, everybody was friendly and supportive and welcoming. So yeah, I'd definitely say do it.
Okay. That's all for this week's episode. We hope you've enjoyed this and the other episodes in this series. That's all for me. Bye for now.
And bye from me.